21 years ago, there was a sequester. It was the last time there was a sequester. It was done as part of the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. It was administered by 3 officials in the Office of Management and Budget. The 3 officials were the budget director, who has since passed away, the general counsel, who has since passed away, and me. And I've been in therapy for the last 20 years, but I was surprised to get a number of phone calls from others when the sequester began to loom after the success of the supercommittee. Oh, did I misspeak? I meant the failure of the supercommittee. After that, I started getting all kind of questions on the sequester and how it would be implemented. So my background of this, and it's more than that, it has come back to haunt me. I am very glad to be at NGA, to be helping states take a look at what it is, and I hope I can spend the next hour or so confusing you guys too. And that will be by intent, because this is an incredibly confusing and complicated process. But I'll try and spend a little time going through it. I think we're going to discuss 6 different items here. The uncertainty that we're facing now, the downside states face from the fiscal cliff, the downsides of alternatives to the fiscal cliff. NGA has 2 meetings every year, and every other year we have a meeting for new governors. And we just had a meeting in San Diego 2 weeks ago for the newly elected governors, and I gave a abbreviated version of this, which I will summarize as the following. Governors, you're damned if they do, and you're damned if they don't. And I will get into that a little bit more as I go through this. We'll talk about some other contributions to downside risks, and then some actions to avoid or mitigate some risks, because there are some things that can come out of this. I am also hope to spend a little time touching on Social Security. Of all the confusing things in the federal budget, Social Security perhaps is the leading one. I hope to be able to talk a little bit about that. But before and please do interrupt me. I'd rather have this be more of a discussion than it is going to be a lecture, and there's going to be some confusing things, so you do not have to wait till the end. Interrupt me if you feel it's appropriate. Now a little bit more about me. I spent the first 30 years of my career with the trifecta and doing federal budget at the General Accounting Office. Then for nearly 20 years at OMB, that was from Carter through all of Bush, through all of Reagan, through all of Bush Sr., and then through most of Clinton, where I rose to be the senior career civil servant at OMB. And then I became the acting and deputy director at the Congressional Budget Office, and also was a member of FASAB. FASAB is the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. You folks probably know GASB, and now I deal regularly with GASB. You probably don't have too much to do with FASB, and almost nothing to do with FASAB, but one of the benefits of my background now is that now I'm extensively involved with GASB, but I was a member of an accounting standards board, and I'm not an accountant. And oh my goodness, they didn't like me very much there either, but that pretty much all my employers felt the same way about that. So, I took a different view on how accounting standards and how they should apply. I'm trying to do that now with GASB, because GASB has been taking efforts to do state and local governments that I think are far beyond the realm of normal accounting standards. Anyways, after doing the U.S. for U.S. budgeting for 30 years, then I left to go in the international area. I was with IMF in Washington. Then I moved to Paris for 5 years and did budgeting from the European and OECD sense. I was a consultant for a while before I came back to Washington. So I have a view of budgeting now from 4 different perspectives: national, international, supranational. If you've ever dealt with people from IMF, that's the way they feel. And now I'm doing it from state perspective, and very glad to be doing it. I can talk about that if I have questions about some of the interactions between the two. There are more similarities, believe it or not, than differences. But we are not Greece. I can explain that too. One more thing, I'm not an R or a D, I'm an SOB. By that I mean I will take a very hard look at whatever proposals come out of it, and I will do that in the current context here. I'm also very much a middle-of-the-roader. A quick little anecdote, my wife and I moved to Paris. I don't speak French. I can speak menu and metro. I knew how to get to the restaurants and what to order. But my wife spoke very good French, and she wasn't working, and I'd come home after working, and I'd see her, and I'd say, her name's Lonnie. I said, Lonnie, did you watch TV? Did you watch the news? She said, yeah, I did. I said, did you watch the French news? She said, no. They speak so fast, number one, and they use an awful lot of slang. And it was hard for me to keep up. I said, well, what'd you watch then, BBC? She said, no, I found something better than BBC. Presents a more honest and balanced and very good look at what's happening in the U.S. and in the world. I said, really? What is it? She says, Al Jazeera. I said, what? She said, yeah, and I started watching it, and I think she's right. My point is, for those of us who are in the middle of the road, it's a shame that you have to go to Dubai to get your news now, but that's how lonely it is, a place it is in the middle of the road. In any case, let me start with my presentation on the fiscal cliff. First of all, what is it? It's composed of all of these different elements, and there are quite a few, not just the sequester or the cut in funding, not just the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, but also there was a payroll tax holiday that was enacted two years ago and extended last year, also extended unemployment benefits. There's the alternative minimum tax, which expired last January, not this January. I'm going to mention that a little bit later. There is something called the doc fix, which is reimbursement rates for Medicare physicians. Then there is a continuing resolution, which has been enacted through March the 27th. You may wonder why March the 27th. Easter is March 31st. Congress said, maybe we want just a few days before the things expire. So it's done. It expires on Wednesday, the 27th of March, a couple of days before Easter. TANF, for those of you who don't know, TANF is the federal welfare program, temporary assistance for needy families. It, I thought, was going to play a major role in the fiscal cliff, and still might, because it is authorized through March 27th. If it is not reauthorized, all 4+ million welfare recipients stop getting checks right away. Not wait, but right away. So it may still play a role. And then finally, the debt limit. I skipped over WARN Act, Worker Adjustment and Renotification, I think, Act, where if you're going to lay a company, not the state or local government, but a company who is going to lay off people, then they're supposed to give 60 days notice or they can be sued. Well, Lockheed told us at our last NGA meeting in Williamsburg in July that they were about to issue WARN Act notices to 100,000 of their employees. This was last July. OMB and the Department of Labor got upset at this, so they started issuing non-legally binding but enough cover for Lockheed not to issue the notices. My point is the WARN Act may be something you guys will hear of quite soon if we start approaching the fiscal cliff and companies start issuing these notices. They haven't done so far, and with some understanding, but if it becomes very likely that we're likely to go off the cliff, they might issue it. Okay, here's what the fiscal cliff was. The idea that we were going to go off the cliff has been known for several months, and I'm, you know some of my history, I'm a long time, but middle of the road, not R or D, very much interested in our fiscal sustainability, and I saw this and I said, good. Why did I say good? Because Washington only responds to budget matters when there's a crisis. And oh my goodness, I've never seen a crisis bigger than this. I thought several months ago that this is exactly what we need. This will finally force us to recognize the difficult situation that Washington is, and I said, good. This is so broad, covers so many people. both the left and the right, the rich and the poor and everybody, this is perfect. That's what I thought. Then I started getting these phone calls on a whole variety of things, including, well, if we do have a sequester, Mary, you're the last one who did this 20 years ago. Do you have to take the cuts right away? By the way, the Fiscal Cliff would have, according to my former employers, IMF and CBO and others, would have detrimental impacts, particularly in the Northeast, but you can see every state would lose a drop in employment of at least 1.4%. So the impacts of going off the cliff are generally recognized as being very negative. But I started getting calls on how we can avoid the fiscal cliff. And I started using Thelma and Louise, but I was wrong, and I'll get to that. Anyways, the sequester, the idea is when Congress appropriates money, it comes from the Appropriations Committees, comes to the White House, the President signs it, or it's overridden as veto, and then it comes to OMB. Why? Because OMB apportions the monies that come. This is a result of the 1921 Act, and it goes back in budgetary history. Congresses before 1921 didn't like the fact that they'd appropriate money directly to an agency. There was no OMB, there was no CBO, there was no GAO. President wasn't involved. The agency would get the money, and they go out and spend it. And sometimes they spend it all right away, and then come back to the Congress and said, oh, look, we've run out of money, we need more. They didn't like that. So they gave OMB the power to apportion it through the year. When Congress passes an appropriation, OMB must apportion it. When Congress passes a cut in an appropriation, the sequester, OMB must apportion that too. But there isn't a rule on how OMB apportions it. If the sequester occurs on the 2nd of January, OMB does not have to apportion all of the cuts as of the 2nd of January. They can allow the agencies to run at their current level for at least a couple of months. Now, because there's a CR, they can't put it all to the end of the fiscal year, but they can put it all into March. Once I started getting calls from the Hill saying, you can go off the cliff and the agencies won't feel the pain immediately, then I started getting more calls. They said, what about the Bush tax cuts? On January 1st, everybody's taxes will go up unless we avoid the cliff. By everybody, I mean not just those with incomes in the top 2%, but the 10% bracket will disappear. Everybody's bracket will go up, and there's a whole long list of other things that will make an impact on every single person in this room. But because the Secretary of the Treasury has the unilateral authority to change withholding rates, again, it doesn't mean that you would immediately see an additional deduction in your paychecks. In other words, you can go off the cliff and not feel the pain. You may say, well, isn't this a tremendously risky thing to do? What happens if we do go off the cliff and we haven't been withholding enough? Doesn't that mean we're going to owe a whole lot of taxes, more taxes, come April the 15th, 2014? The answer to that is definitely. But it has been done before. If there's a feeling that we can avoid the fiscal cliff in the new Congress, again, you can go off it. In addition to that, there's a couple of other things. How about the debt limit? One of the most severe things. But the 2012 deficit turned out to be $200 billion less than anticipated. So right now, the debt limit, which is $16,394 billion, is going to be hit sometime later this month. But the Treasury Department has a variety of gimmicks and games and extraordinary measures, so it can push off the debt limit, really binding, until sometime until March. The CR is already done till March, as is TANF. What we've heard from Medicare physicians is they'll play the game too. They'll charge at the lower rates, about 30% lower, but hope that the fiscal cliff is fixed, doc fixed, and then they'll get reimbursed later. All of a sudden, there's this powerful move. You may have heard of it from both R's and D's. I think Senator Murray from Washington has been the leader on the Democratic side, saying, give us everything we want, or we'll go off the cliff. But she's not been the only one. There have been those on the other side. And it's all been supported by this. The idea of we can go off the cliff and the real pain won't occur right away. Even Ben Bernanke helped on this, perhaps inadvertently, with his announcement of QE, or quantitative easing 3, where he said he's going to be buying $40 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities. The idea of the immediate economic impact is going to be mitigated. So I was using Thelma and Louise, the idea of, hey, here's Congress now going off the cliff, and they're doing it willingly, but they're going to face the consequences. But I've stopped doing that. I've stopped doing that because it seems Congress has a little bit different view now. Now I use Wile E. Coyote. That is, Congress goes off the cliff, and if you remember Wile E. Coyote, he'd go off the cliff, and he'd have a look on his face, but those legs would keep on churning. But the important thing is, he wouldn't fall until he looked down. I think that's what Congress is looking at it now. They can go off the cliff, and they won't fall because they won't look down. Well, I think that's a pretty dangerous view. But it's the one that I think is prevailing right now by both sides, both the Republicans and the Democrats, is that we can go off the cliff, force those other guys to give us a better deal when we come back, and we have 2 months or so before the real bad consequences occur. So here are a variety of the things on the fiscal cliff. You can see some of the dollar magnitudes on them and the exact impact of them and how they come just in the remainder of the federal fiscal year to almost $500 billion. These are the kinds of things that they think, even though in adding up the impact on the economy would be major, that you can go off the cliff. So, now bringing this home to state governments, what's the impact? Actually, for state revenues, it's not bad. For most states, except for those, what do I have, 6 on the bottom. For most states, the couple of bullets on this chart indicates that state revenues are actually going to increase. I think that's sort of a false hope, however, because if we go into recession, the minor impacts of increasing these revenue aspects will be more than mitigated by the fact that the economy will be considerably less. But the impact on of the expiration of the tax cuts could be positive to most states because of the way that those states that collect income taxes. There are 7 states, I think, that don't use income taxes. And by the way, one of the expiring tax provisions, you see that one down there, expired tax extenders, that $30 billion, one of the aspects of that, about $2 or $3 billion, is for those 7 states, that is, that don't have income taxes but do have sales taxes. The deductibility of the sales taxes expires on January 1st. So they lose on that too. Okay, I mentioned the AMT, Alternative Minimum Tax. It was passed, I believe, in 1969 when it was revealed that there were a number of millionaires who didn't pay any taxes. And so they had a procedure of which people calculate their tax, and they calculated the normal way, and then they calculated this alternative way. Well, they didn't index it back in 1969, so Congress has, they called, fixed it or patched it every year. What isn't realized widely now is the last patch expired last January. Not coming up, it's already expired. And if they don't fix it in the next month, I bet that virtually every person in this room has under-withheld, which means come April the 15th, you're all in for a surprise. Why do I say that? Because there are 2 major factors that account for 80% of the differences between the alternative minimum tax and the regular tax. Those 2 are deductions and exemptions. Deductions for state and local property, income and sales tax, and exemptions, family exemptions. Think about it now. Think about you guys when you last did your tax. You go and you calculate your income, and then you calculate some credits, and then you come to Schedule A, right? Top thing on Schedule A is how many state and local property, income, and sales taxes, depending upon where you live. And then go back up to the start. Think about the exemptions for families. But you can't count them, and you can't count the deductions. And there's some other stuff you can't count. Basically, the expiration of the alternative minimum tax hits the middle and upper middle class. It doesn't hit the top 2%. Why not? Because they're already paying the higher rate. So if you look at that last bullet, 45% of those with incomes between $75,000 and $100,000 a year. Between $75,000 and $100,000, that's not exactly your top 2%. 45% of those will be paying the AMT if they don't hatch it, as opposed to 0.4%. Well, this is another element that, again, 6 months ago I said, oh, goody, goody, goody. We're going to get to something that will really force Congress and the president to get together and agree. I'm not quite so sure anymore. But my bottom line on this is pay attention to this AMT. They've got to resolve it, because if they don't, you owe it, but you don't know it. And you'll owe it again come the 15th of April. Can they fix it after the 1st of January? Yes. But they can't fix it much beyond the 1st of January, because IRS, which may be sequestered, by the way, and be losing employees, only has so many people and so much time to change the tax forms. And if they don't do it in time, I can guarantee you everybody's taxes will be delayed. So if you have over-withheld, as many people do, and file your tax returns early, as many people do, in the hope of getting a return from the IRS, you won't be getting it soon. You won't even be getting it April 15th. You'll have to wait till May or June or something like that. This is a big deal that hasn't been discussed much. Is it going to be resolved? I hope so. But I'm not so sure anymore. All right, I'm now going to move beyond the fiscal cliff to saying where I started with the governors 2 weeks ago. You're damned if they do, and you're damned if they don't. The major problem we face in the U.S. is long-term fiscal sustainability. It's not borrowing money now. We're running trillion-dollar deficits, and we can borrow every penny we want relatively easily. People are basically, by people, I mean not just the Chinese or the Japanese or the oil exporters, but people all around the world and in the U.S. are willing to lend the government money at extraordinarily low rates. In some cases, at negative real rates. We don't have problems borrowing now. We have a problem, as this chart indicates, of the long-term sustainability. Let's see if I can do this. No. That is, if you look at what the projections are, you can see that in not too many years, we will have debt as a percent of GDP higher than we've ever had it before. And this only stops only in 25 years and growing exponentially. Why? This table, I think, explains it better than any others. The major drivers of our debt in the future are health, Social Security, and revenues. Let me repeat that again. Healthcare costs, Social Security, and revenues. Look at the lines indicated Medicare and Medicaid. The chart here indicates percentage of GDP for the next 25 years, and I've also listed the first column there for the last 25 years. You can see that deserving, needy old people like me are going to be drawing on our Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security in the years ahead. And because of the amounts and the way our systems are set up, those amounts are going to climb, so much so that they are going to double over the next 25 years, but even over the next 10 years. They are the primary drivers of why our spending is going up so high. Now you may say, but this is a problem with revenues. And in one sense, you're absolutely right. Let's take a look at the revenue line down there at the bottom. Currently, we're at 15.7, extraordinarily low. Why? Because we're still coming out of the recession. That number is clearly going to jump up. It's going to go up even this year, 2013, up towards 18%, even without the changes in tax law as the economy improves. But take a look at the historical average. Last 25 years, we've been at about 18% of GDP. If we're headed towards spending at 24, 25%, I'm not even going out to 25, but 24, 25%, and our revenues are a historic 18%. Think of it this way. For the federal government to balance its budget at spending at 24% of GDP, every tax, every fee, every payroll tax you pay will have to go up by a third. Oh, no, that can't probably be true. Well, we can do it by just raising it on the top 2%, can't we? No. You could, as I was living in Paris, you know, they had an election a year ago, Francis Hollande was elected. He is a socialist, and he wants to raise the top marginal tax rate on the French to 75%. You could do that. That might have an impact on the economy, and I'm going to talk about that. But my point is that under any realistic point of view, the idea of raising taxes that high is probably not acceptable politically by both the Republicans and the Democrats, let alone by the public. So if you can't raise the taxes up to 24%, raise them by a third, what do you have to do? The answer is you've got to cut health spending. Social Security plays. What about defense? What about NASA? I was not, by the way, a quick comment on Captain Lovell's. I was not at CBO when CBO said in 2005 that the George W. Bush administration's proposal to put a man on Mars would not cost $5 billion, as the Bush administration said, but 15. Part of the problem we have in our system in Washington is, and thank goodness for CBO, is that administrations, both Republican and Democrat, will sell you a bill of goods, and the bill of goods will turn out to be much more expensive. He bemoaned the fact that we're not continuing this. I think with a more realistic sense of how much it would cost, we'd have a much better idea of whether we should continue it or not. So thank goodness to my colleagues at CBO who had a better estimate of what it would really cost. Getting back to this, though, this chart, I want to now emphasize that bottom line. I've used the phrase fiscal unsustainability. Fiscal unsustainability is defined as debt as a percentage of GDP, but at what levels? Well, a couple of people, Carmen Reinhardt at the University of Maryland, Brookings, and Ken Rogoff, formerly IMF chief economist, now at Harvard, did a landmark study. I think the title was This Time is Different. And they looked at many countries over many years, and they said, let's take a look at debt as a percent of GDP and growth. Let's see what happens. What they found was if you have debt as a percent of GDP at 60% or below, the growth rates of countries who have that are high. If it's 90 or above, they're lower, sometimes negative. And between 60 and 90, it depends upon the conditions. We're in bad shape, guys. We're going very fast towards a situation, if you take it, where we're going to be above 90%. We're able to borrow money now at very low interest rates, but for how long? According to their research, we're going to be hitting 90% relatively quickly. And then what does that do to all of us? All of us, not just in terms of state governments and local governments, all of us not just in terms of the federal government, but I know I've refinanced my home, and if you guys haven't yet, you should, because these rates aren't going to stay here forever. And what does it do to economic growth? Okay, I want to go on about health. First of all, can we grow out of this situation? We've been bailed out by real growth before. Well, these numbers come from CBO. Here's the CBO estimates. They're already relatively high. And these were done a couple of months ago before census came out and said the population, and there's two factors in long-term economic projections, population and productivity. Before CBO came out, the census came out and said the population growth is a little bit lower than what we thought. So that 2.5% from 2018 to 22 and the 2.5 for 2023 to 2037 is already on the high side. Are we going to grow out of it? I hope so, but I don't think it's something we can count on. Let's talk about tax expenditures here. I said that the problems of our long-term fiscal sustainability were Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and revenues. By the way, I've spent a lot of time in the international world, and I've been asked how to go about cutting your budget. And I say, well, there are 4 steps. First step, take a look at everything you've spent. Scrub it. Go through it in detail. Make sure that it is exactly what you want. Second step, redo the first step. Because when you haven't done it well, and you almost certainly haven't, it'll be too high. Third step, redo steps 1 and 2. Go through your spending again. Make sure it is only what you really need. Fourth step, do revenues. Why? Because if you do it the other way around and start with revenues, you don't get to spending. You frequently only do revenues again. Again, I'm not out to say, I'm not taking a position opposite of President Obama's proposal. I think I know why he wants to do that, but I say from a country, what we really need to do is resolve where we want that total spending line to be, and where then once we do that, getting the revenues up there so we get a fiscal sustainable picture. We can't grow our way out of it. Let's talk about tax expenditures. And here's something that's important to everybody in this room. I put this table together off of OMB data, and I combined the 2 provisions that benefit states the most, the deductibility of state and local income, sales, and property taxes, and the exclusion of interest on public purpose state and local bonds. As you can see, on the top 10 hit parade, we're number 2. But we're more than number 2. We've got this great big red bullseye on us. Why? Look at the other things on the list. You think that we are going to get preferential treatment towards number 3? Do you think we are going to get preferential treatment towards number 8? Do you think we are going to get preferential treatment towards number 1? We are being targeted. There was a Washington Post editorial just the other day that said the first thing you ought to do is get rid of the special provisions that help state and local government. NGA recognizes this. As I said, I was just talking to governors. We set up a special task force at NGA. I was just telling Chris that had he asked me just a few days ago to do this speech, I would have turned him down because we have got a meeting with the president on Tuesday. I leave here tomorrow, go back. And one of the things we're going to be trying to talk to him about is not this specific table, but to say, look, Mr. President, we're an important part of this process. We are not bystanders, we are instrumental in it. You need to involve us in this. We're not going to take a position on the Obama position or what might come from the Republicans, but we're going to say we need to be involved in this. And what we're going to try to do with this task force is to say something, if you're going to look at tax expenditures, and I think that's almost a given, look at them on an aggregate perspective, not on an item-by-item perspective. If we're looked at on an item-by-item perspective, our fear is that we're going to be singled out and get disproportionate cuts. But does this matter? Yes. By the way, tax expenditures in crude terms total about $1 trillion a year. This top 10 is 3/4 of it. You've got to hit the things on this table or you don't hit them. But you can hit them through overall deductions or limits, $50,000 or $25,000 limit, or a haircut on Schedule A or some mechanism like that. Okay, I frequently use this chart because I want to get into taxes a little bit. It is the thing I ask when I lecture on budgeting, the thing that people don't recognize. That is, when you get your paycheck, you have a little deduction that says FICA on there. It's for Social Security and Medicare. You are probably aware that your employer pays the same amount that you do, right? 6.2% for Social Security, he pays 6.2%. 1.45% unlimited on Medicare, he pays 1.45. The question I ask is, all right, think about taxpayers across the country. How many taxpayers pay more for payroll, including the employer portion, than they do on income taxes? The bottom line, 4 out of 5. Think about that for a second. 4 out of 5, 80% of Americans pay more in payroll taxes, again, including the employer share, than they do in income taxes. Oh, but it's worse than that. Payroll taxes are regressive. By regressive, that means the richer you are, the less you pay. Why is that? People say the reason why the highest and top 1% pay a low amount is because Social Security taxes are capped at $110,000. If they were uncapped, and that is a proposal by a lot of folks, then that figure would go up. You're right, it would go up. It'd still be regressive. Why? Because these are payroll taxes. And as we've learned from scrutinizing Mr. Romney's tax returns, he gets a whole lot of his money from outside of payroll sources. That is, capital gains, dividends, that type of thing. So the payroll tax is inherently regressive. And 4 out of 5 pay more. Why haven't you heard of this before? Why isn't this a major issue right now? Why aren't we trying to take a tax that impacts the poor more than it does the rich, and is more important for 4 out of 5 Americans? In fact, why has the AARP opposed the 2% Social Security tax holiday that will expire on January 1st? Well, I'm going to get to that. It has to do with the myth of Social Security. It has to do with Scrooge McDuck. It has to do with people who haven't been to 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue, not 1600, but 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue, the Treasury Building. They think, in part because the U.S. federal government tells them that there is money down there, and it's your money, and we've been taking it and storing it down there, and you're going to get it back. I've been down to the basement of the Treasury. There's no money down there. There's about $16 trillion worth of debt down there right now, and some leaking pipes. That's all that's down there, guys. But that's the kind of myth that's been perpetuated. And if you ever they used to send it out 3 months before your birthday. You get this little thing out, and how much you paid. Remember that? Oh goodness, look, I paid there, and if I continue to pay, I'm going to get $2,000 or $3,000 a month. Boy, you look at that, and it looks like a savings account. Oh, goodness, I've been a good boy or girl. I was speaking to a group of students not long ago on Social Security, and I said, I'd like to summarize my talk by handing out a summary before I get into Social Security. And I had a great big cardboard box, and I passed it out, and in the cardboard box were lollipops. And every one of the students took out a lollipop. And so after I did this, I had 25 students all holding this lollipop. And they said, Mr. Anderson, this is a summary of your talk. I said, yes, it is. They said, well, how is that? And I said, because if any of you believe you're going to get full Social Security benefits, you're a bigger sucker than what you have in your hand. It got the point across. Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to taxes. Again, you've heard a lot about the top 1% or 2%. Here's what our marginal tax rates are now. Here's what they will go to on January 1st unless we change the law. Here's what President Obama would like them to go to on the top 2 rates. They'd like them to go to that. All right, let's go on a little bit. Let's talk about what happens with taxes. Who pays them? Here are the average rates, not the marginal rates. That's the rate on your last dollar of income. Here are the average rates, and who pays them out. I presented this chart many times, and people look at it and they say, oh, Mr. Anderson, you have made a mistake. Look at those figures for the lowest and the second lowest quintiles. You put a negative sign in there. That's wrong. How can people pay negative taxes? It's not wrong. For income taxes, the bottom 40% of our nation gets money back. However, I put both income and total because you can see that when you take into account total taxes, they don't get money back. This is yet another reflection of the regressive nature of the payroll taxes. The income taxes, as you can see, are very progressive. The higher incomes pay much more. And this is average taxes. This is not marginal taxes. This is what people actually pay on average. So the top 1% is paying about, on average, 21% of their income. The top 20% is paying 13.4%. But again, to emphasize that that's just the federal income tax. If you take into account payroll, it's regressive. This chart gets into account who pays the share monies. You can see that the impact of the income tax is to increase the amount of income after taxes for everybody but the top. It's redistributed. But again, the amount of that is affected by the payroll tax. Now, let me go back to this right away. Oops, this one. Why do the Republicans hate this? Because it will impact the economy. They use something called the Laffer curve. Has anybody heard of the Laffer curve? Let me spell that. L-A-F-F-E-R, not L-A-U-G-H-T-E-R. A couple of people have heard it. Named after Art Laffer, a guy who was at OMB, and he got to President Reagan, it is alleged, I think this is true, and drew this little thing on a napkin. Let me start off. I said I'm not an ROD, but an SOB. I'm not. I'm middle of the road. I believe in this curve. Specifically, I believe in 3 points of it. You see that point on the bottom that says 0? That is, if you have a tax rate of 0, you will collect 0 income. I believe in that point. You see the point that says 100 over there? If you have a tax rate of 100, you'll collect 0 income because nobody will work. I believe in that point. And there is some curve in there that produces the highest point. What is it? Well, this is just a hypothetical drawing of it, but I believe there is some point there. That is, instead of the numbers that we had before, this, you know, maybe we could change taxes and the revenues would go up or down. It depends upon where we are on this. Well, I've done a lot of research on this. This is basically the reasons why the Republicans don't want to increase taxes, because they fear if you go up on here, you're on the right side of the middle line. You go up in the tax rates, you'll actually reduce revenues. Why will you reduce revenues? Because it'll impact the economy. As I said, I believe in this chart. I believe there are 3 points on this chart. And I've done a lot of research and I found out what the real chart looks like. I'm trying to make a point here that when Ronald Reagan came in as president, he, as you guys probably remember, he was born in Illinois and was very poor, and then he moved to Iowa and then to California, and then he became a B actor. We don't call B actors anymore, we call straight to DVD actors, but in any case, he became a B actor and made a whole pile of money, and then World War II came along. You know what his top marginal tax rate was? World War II? 92%. He finally escapes poverty, starts making money, and now he's paying 92 cents on the dollar. When he became president, it had dropped down to 70 cents on the dollar, and Art Laffer came along with that. Boy, did he buy it. And you know what? I can buy it too. I think that a 70% rate can have detrimental impact. But 39.6 to 35, I'm not too sure. Now, I said I'm not an ROD. Now let me take a little swipe at Mr. President Obama here. He just came out with a proposal with $50 billion for a, what's it called, a something bank, investment bank or something like that. Gosh, I have spent an awful lot of time in budgeting, as you know, and I've seen that whenever you put a priority on something, oh, it gets the funding, but does it produce the results? I'm not sure it does. Will this $50 billion actually do the equivalent of the Laffer curve for spending? I know from our perspective being state and local governments, yes, we'd like to see that done. But you need to do it very judiciously. You need to reward those programs that are best for it. But I say this only to say, these are the arguments that we're having in Washington. On one side, the Republicans are saying, Laffer curve, if you raise taxes, the economy will go down. And the other side, the Democrats are saying, we need to stimulate the economy. Throw more money into it, and the economy will go up. It's actually the same argument, but two different sides of the coin. Okay, now I've been saying that health is our major problem. Of all the tables I do on this presentation, this is the most significant one. We are so far ahead of the rest of the developed world, it is unfathomable. We are currently spending 17.4% of our GDP on health. The OECD average, what's OECD? That's 23 Western European countries, US, Canada, and Mexico, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and Korea. They've added a couple more since I left. Chile and a couple of others. It's the developed world. We're twice the level of the developed world. Spending twice. And I put that column on there, public, to say it's not just public. As you can see, France, Germany, Denmark, and the UK all have higher total spending than we do, but still considerably lower total spending. This is our problem, guys. This is what we're facing now. Now, this comes from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies. This problem has been recognized for years. Did the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, did it help the situation? Frequently it's called about bending the cost curve. I got this data, and I'm sorry it doesn't match up, but this is the way they produce it. Did it bend the cost curve? Yep. It made it worse. By the way, from a personal perspective, I have 3 kids, all in their 30s. All 3 of my kids lost their jobs during the financial fallout. You're looking at their health insurance. I can't wait for affordable care to kick in. I'm going to be relieved considerably. By the way, they all found other jobs and now have other insurance. But personally, I'm about to benefit. But from an aggregate sense, you can see from these figures, the situation was not made better by the Affordable Care Act. Yes, it did some good things. As I said, it expanded coverage. But from a cost perspective, it did not make better. And this comes from the Obama administration, not from CBO, not from NGA or somebody else, but from the Obama administration. Why? Here's another picture. This shows us, way over on the right, health spending per capita. And it shows life expectancy, not the only factor. But you can see, we're a whole lot worse than a whole lot of other countries that spend less. We're better than a few, but look at the amount we spend. Other reasons why. Where does the money go? Higher prices. Here are a variety of procedures in 6 different countries. This is the price that they pay relative to the U.S. The U.S. is 100. Every procedure, every country, they pay less. Little anecdote. I lived in Paris for 5 years. I'm a retired Fed. I couldn't give up my federal health insurance because once you give it up, you never get it back. So I had to keep it. But I was insured in Paris. I was insured by my employer and by the French. It's a different system there. As I say, my French wasn't too good, particularly medical French. Oh my goodness. So I asked friends, I had to go see a doctor. You can do it on the internet. I looked for a doctor. I saw that he spoke English. I go into the room or this little office. I open the door. There's 2 or 3 people sitting there reading magazines. Just 2 or 3 people sitting there reading magazines. I didn't know what to do. I stood there. Finally, another door opens up. Out comes a guy in a white coat. He looks at me. I look at him. He looks at me. Monsieur Anderson, I go in. We start talking English. He does what he has to do. Everything's fine. I pay him 25 euros in cash. When's the last time you actually paid a doctor in cash? That's the way you do it. And that was the copay. But then I said, look, I'm in the budgeting world, I do a lot of this. Don't you have an assistant? He said, oh yeah, she comes in twice a week. I come back to the States. I go to an ophthalmologist. I'm an old man. She does an exam. She looks in my eye and says, Mr. Anderson, you have a freckle on your retina. I said, what? She says, you have a freckle on your retina. I said, there are such things. Oh yeah. And just like freckles on your skin, you have to have them reviewed. They can't be cancerous. The fact that you have one is not bad. But you need to go to a retina specialist. So off I went to the retina specialist in Washington. Go in there, they do their thing. Why is my point on this? After this experience in France, I counted it. I saw 7 people before I saw the doctor. Think about it now. Think of when you go see the doctor the next time. How many people you see before you actually see the doctor? You see schedulers, you see nurses, you see technicians, you see people up to follow up on things. As I say, this one guy in France, and they're in bad shape. They're number 2 on the list.
What's their cost of medical school education?
Pardon me?
Those countries you listed, what their cost of medical school education?
The fact that it's subsidized, you mean?
Compared to the United States.
I don't know the answer. I know this. When I went to see doctors in France, my wife and I, we did ask to find doctors, my wife did specifically, asked to see doctors who spoke English, obviously. My wife, whose French was very good, her medical French was not good. And my friend, some very good friends in Paris, looked at us aghast. She said, do you really think we would recommend you to see a doctor here in Paris who hasn't been trained in the US? An awful lot of the better doctors are trained here. You are right. That is perhaps one of the reasons, but it's not the only reason. In fact, here's some other aspects. Higher spending on every different category. We use more, all right? We spend a whole lot more. The cost is a lot more. But what can we do about it? Oh, by the way, I wanted to do this. It's not that we don't have better care sometimes. You may have heard about Saudi princes and things like that coming to the U.S. For breast cancer or colorectal cancer, the U.S. is clearly better. But look at the bottom 2 things. Hospital admissions for asthma and pulmonary admissions. Yes, sir?
Question has to do with tort remedy in France. I know in Mexico tort remedy isn't available, so healthcare is significantly, let's say that's the only reason, but that's one reason.
Here is a list of things that needs to be done. One of them is malpractice insurance, product liability tort remedy. It is much different than. I like to say I live in a suburb of Washington, Bethesda, Maryland, and my area is very wealthy. Not a lot of nice homes, and far too many lawyers. Well, many of which practice medicine. But in any case, part of this is that we have a very generous system. So with respect to your question, take a look at all these. I'll give you an example. It has to do with a freckle on my eye or something else. Think of the last time you went to see a physician and, oh, yes, we better run some tests. And then he sends you to a machine. Well, in France and other countries, the doctors don't own the machines. In the U.S., we have corporate medicine. The doctor owns the machine. It usually is very good and very expensive, and he wants to get the most use out of it. Why? Because he profits by it. In France and the other countries, they send you to a machine, but they don't profit by it. Somebody else can separate that. Fee for service is so ingrained for us in the U.S., it's hard for us to think differently. But that is one of the primary things that we do. Instead of trying to create incentives for better health, our system is incentives to bill your insurance company. But there's a whole lot of things here that we need to do. How am I doing on time?
You're doing actually really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can talk back.
No, you're doing well, and obviously this is a very well attended.
All right. My point of this is health is our major fiscal problem. Are revenues a part? Of course they are. Is Social Security a part? I'm going to get to that. But health is our major problem. And health means Medicare, Medicaid, and private health. And this is the kind of things we need to do. Now I want to get to Social Security. Very confusing program. These are the fundamental characteristics with my good friend Scrooge McDuck at the basement of the Treasury Office. Social Security is an intergenerational program. It was started in the 1930s, as you probably know. That is, in the 1930s, we had poor people. I mean, we had elderly people, and they were very poor. How to help them out? Well, we created a system. It had, I think, tax rates at that time of 1.2%, very low. But the idea was, you get the people who are working at the time, you take a little bit of the money from them, and you give it to the people retired. It worked. It substantially helped the standard of living of the retired elderly people in the 1930s. Well, how do you do this? You create a compact, if you will. You say, okay, you guys, when you retire, we'll take a little bit out of the money of the people who are working at that time and give it to you. An intergenerational transfer. And it was always meant to be pay as you go. That is, you take a little money and you give it to the people who retire, right? It continued to work. Everything was fine until I came along. That is, I'm a baby boomer. And all of a sudden things went sort of haywire. Haywire in a good sense. Because once the Social Security and the administration started looking at this, they saw the people, they saw this. They said, hey, we can do something good here. We can up the benefits. And boy, did they. Then the next generation came along. And as I like to say, the next generation had a fundamental problem. They didn't like sex. I don't understand it myself, but for some reason, I said that once before, and somebody of that generation raised their hand and said, no, Mr. Anderson, you're wrong. We liked it as much as you did. We just knew how to control ourselves. So, but what happened was, instead of this, you had this. And that's what we're facing now. Far fewer workers in this intergenerational pay-as-you-go system. The obligations are defined there. They are not a function of invested taxes. They are set by Congress. And they are mildly progressive. So they zap higher income earners a little bit more. Now, that's the way that the fundamental characteristics, I like to put it this way. But in any case, a lot of people don't understand that way, so I don't talk about it much. I said that I talk about confusion. A lot of what you hear from Social Security is to talk about it only in the first method, because there's three different ways of looking at it. There's an accounting, there's a budget, and there's economic. In the accounting method, there is something called a trust fund. Have no trust in the trust. Now, there is something called a trust fund. And you talk about solvency. And the trust fund is not solvent forever, but it will pay benefits through 2033. By the way, Social Security is technically OASDI, Old Age Survivors and Disability. The disability, that is what you would get from Social Security if you had an accident, that becomes insolvent in 2016. It is done, that's happened before, and then the Old Age Survivors lends money to it, and so I'm talking about old age and survivors now. All right, that lasts until 2033. That is the way you hear it talked about most. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's legitimate. It's a good way to track things, but it's not the only way. Then there's the budget. You may have heard some politicians say, Social Security has not added a dime to the federal deficit. Well, not exactly. Again, think back at Scrooge McDuck. Think of 1500 Pennsylvania Avenue. Think of money coming in the windows there from taxes, from payroll taxes, from fees, from all this other stuff. And then think money going out. If you think of it that way, money's been coming in for Social Security and money's been going out. Has the amount been going out more than the money coming in the last several years? Yes. Why does some of the people claim that? Because they look at it from the accounting perspective. And they say some of the money that goes into the trust fund, again, legitimate, but not the only way, comes from interest on federal securities. When I worked in the Clinton administration, I went to President Clinton, a very smart guy, and at that time they were talking about privatizing it, and I said, well, look, instead of investing in special issue Social Security, special issue federal trust securities, how about we create a new security? Here's what the security says. The federal treasury will pay the Social Security Administration at a rate equal to the return on the S&P 500, unless the S&P 500 drops below the treasury rate. Heads, you win. Tails, you win. That way, you could say you're going to be paying into the Social Security Trust Fund the amount that is earned on stocks, but it'll never drop below treasury. Hey, why not? He didn't buy it, unfortunately, I think, but what would it have done to the federal budget? Not a damn thing. It is an accounting mechanism. Yes, it would have helped the trust fund aspect. Would it have helped the budget aspect? No, because the money's going out from one end, would have come right into the other end. But the thing I want to talk to you guys most about is that third measure. It's not just accounting. It's not just budget. It's the economic growth. I'm very fortunate. I live with my 10-year-old granddaughter. Every morning I get up, she has breakfast with me. Her name is Kylie. I go, Kylie, you got a job yet? Grandpa, why do you always say that? I said, because I'm getting older and you need to get to work in order to fund my benefits. Well, think about it the same way. Here we are, the U.S. I'm thinking of a sort of a pie here, right? Our economy, 15 trillion or something like that. And a slice of that pie goes to me, or particularly people who get Medicare and Medicaid and are retired. All right, we take out a slice. In the future, there's going to be a lot more than of me. That slice is going to grow. Remember the table I had in there. Either that's when that slice grows, everybody else gets a little bit less, or we grow the size of the pie. Here's what CBO says the pie is going to look like. From 10.4% now, depending upon whether you assume we go off the cliff or not, use the alternative baseline, we're going up to 12.9 and 16.6. So of the pie, we old people are consuming 10%. We're about to consume almost 13, and it's going to go up to 16.6. Either my granddaughter and all your kids and grandkids are going to have to work a lot harder and accept a lot less, or we're going to have to grow the size of the pie bigger. How do we grow the pie bigger? One is to increase net national savings. One way to increase net national savings is to run surpluses. We're sort of missing that a little. Another way is to say the slice is too big. Cut the slice. Increase the retirement age. That's already happened, guys. It was done in '83, right? Your parents could retire at full Social Security benefits at 65. You can't get it until you're probably 67. I get it at 66, which is Another thing is index to prices, not wages. How's that again? Again, remember when I talked about well, what they did back in the 70s, they said, oh, no, we won't index to prices. We won't keep the Social Security benefits on so you can buy the same. We'll index it to wages. Is there a difference? Oh my gosh, yes. Why? Because wages reflect not only price levels, but also productivity. So when the current generation works harder and wages go up, not just prices, but wages, the retired generation gets more money. Could we change that? Yes. Does AARP oppose it? Yes. But is that something that could be done? Yeah. Could we cut everything else? Could we increase Social Security taxes? Could we convert to private accounts? Piles of other things. We could do that. By the way, how about increasing Social Security taxes? Does that help? From the trust fund perspective, it does. From the monetary perspective, it does. From the economic perspective, no. All it's doing is taking money out of part of the pie that's not working and giving it to the part of the pie that's in. That is. Yes, sir.
If we do create guest worker programs, other countries are dealing with this. Canada has a very successful program for bringing in guest workers to augment their production in the workforce. Aren't they, or is there a way for them to pay into the system, even though they're not going to stay?
My understanding is guest workers do pay. The problem was, and this is something back that I mentioned in '83, you may remember a guy named David Stockman, Reagan's first budget director. The problem is that those guys and gals come over here, work, earn benefits, and then have the audacity to go back in their countries and claim the benefits. If they would only go back and not claim the benefits, we'd be fine. And by the way, that's sort of what it used to be. But now they claim the benefits, and they're eligible for them. They don't need to be U.S. citizens in order to either pay in or claim benefits. You could get them. You could change that law, but that's a pretty serious thing to do, particularly if you have guest workers coming in and paying into the system and saying, okay, you pay in, but you don't get nothing back.
You can split the difference.
Split the difference? Well, all right. I don't have split the difference on there.
No,
But
based on their standard of living, cost of living in foreign country, or you pay into their social security system.
I think even if you do that, there are 310 million Americans. What's the amount of guest workers that we have at any one time?
75,000.
Not even going to make a difference in rounding, I fear. Let me just refer back, swap Treasury debt for equities. Again, it's a pay-as-you-go intergenerational system. That website there was, before I joined NGA, Esquire magazine. I hadn't read Esquire since I was in college, but they called me up and they said, Barry, we'd like you to help us out. This is in 2010. We'd like you to help us out. We want to figure out a way to balance the budget by 2010, by 2020. And we're going to get 4 former members of Congress, 4 former senators, and we'd like you to be the scorekeeper because you've been at OMB and CBO. So I did. Went up to the Hearst building in New York, and the 4 former members were John Danforth of Missouri, Gary Hart of Colorado, Bill Bradley of New Jersey, and Bob Packwood of Oregon. And they locked the 5 of us in a room with a pile of other people, and we went out and did it. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that in one sense, they did what I'm suggesting that ought to be done. We had 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, but what we started off was, where do you want to balance the budget at? Do you want to balance it at 24%? Do you want to balance it at 18% of GDP? Where do you want to balance that? And the Republicans wanted to balance it at the lowest level possible. The Democrats sort of did too. And they compromised at about 21%. It was the right process. And they, by the way, they did a pile of things with Social Security. If you get a look at that website, you can see what was done. But at least the process was right in doing that. Okay, that's my finishing up on Social Security. Now, I said to the governors, you're damned if they do, you're damned if they don't. I indicated how you're damned if they do go off the fiscal cliff. I indicated how you're damned if they don't go off the fiscal cliff. And here's some things, if you don't go off the fiscal cliff, what I see the governors facing. I said to the governors, this is the high water mark. I don't see things getting better from the amounts of money you're getting from the federal government. This is about as good as it's ever going to be. Plan for it. Medicaid? No, I just don't see it. I go back to the fiscal sustainability problems. Maybe for the next couple of years it will be okay, and they'll absorb in the Affordable Care Act some of the increased participants. But there's no way to solve the problems, whether it's done now or it's done next year or it's done 5 years from now. There's no way to solve the problems without looking at help. Tax expenditures, again, we have a great big red dot right on our backs. You better face up to the fact that this is about as good as it's going to get. It's not that it's going to go away. There are ways to prevent it from being eliminated entirely, but probably not going to get much better. Discretionary programs, they weren't the major contributor, but you know they're going to be hit even more, whether we have a sequester or not. And that includes probably infrastructure too, particularly transportation. It's a world the governors need to face. It's a world, not necessarily a pleasant one, but it's better off that they plan for this than if they don't. Other contributors to downside risk. I mentioned the continuing resolution and TANF that they expire on March 27th. In addition, those 4 programs down there all need to be reauthorized. However, despite this gloom, there is some little bit of good aspects. Here are the principles that the governors agreed to and what we'll be talking about with President Obama on Tuesday at the White House. We're not going to take a position on his proposals, but we are going to take a position on each one of these 4 items. Our chair, Governor Markell of Delaware, is going to articulate them and be seconded by Governor Fallin of Oklahoma. We're going to try and get this to say, don't put all of the balancing on the backs of the state and local governments. It's a shared thing, and we can help. But you've got to involve us in the process. Some of the things we can do is not only track the system and impact, as I'm saying, in the tax expenditure, but also, as was indicated before, on marketplace fairness. We see this dark cloud that I've been painting as an opportunity to get something marketplace fairness. After we leave the White House on Tuesday, we go meet with Senate Majority Leader Reid and Senator Durbin. And we will be definitely talking about this on Tuesday afternoon on marketplace fairness. I mentioned the tax reform task force and the governor's principles. My long experience continues to bug me, and so I was asked with some other guys to put together what a grand bargain might look like. And this can be done either this month or next, where you postpone the fiscal cliff, but you pass the equivalent or the reality of a budget resolution. And the importance of a budget resolution is it commits the next Congress, but allows the Congress to pass the laws that cut spending or change taxes with 51 votes, not 60. Is there a way to do it? Yes. This is the outlines of doing that. Okay, my last comment. Oh, one more, by the way. Here's a table. Second to last. Here's what Obama and Boehner almost agreed to. If you're looking for some silver lining in this cloud, what they came very close to agreeing to in July of last year was this deal. In fact, I like to say, have you ever bought a car? You go into the showroom, you kick the tires, you're sitting around, you take a test drive, you talk about the options and the accessories, you sit down with the salesman and you cut a deal. You shake hands. The salesman says, I got to go check with my manager. You may say, I got to go check with my spouse. That's what happened in July 2011. Obama and Boehner agreed on this deal, shook hands on it. Obama said, I got to go check with my people. He did. They told him, you sold out. That revenue number ought to be 1.2 trillion, not 800 billion. You sold out too cheap. And in addition, they said, Boehner can't deliver. He'll never get 800 billion out of that. If he can't get 800 billion, ask for more. The Post, the Times, and Bob Woodward all reported this. Obama calls Boehner back up. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but the deal we got, I got to get 1.2 trillion. I don't think the words left his mouth before Boehner said, not only no, but no deal, no way, no how. Now, could Boehner deliver on the 800 billion? I don't know. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe Obama was right. But it never got to the House. But they shook hands on this deal. Could a deal like this still be done? Again, they shook hands on it, the two of them. I would point out something, though. If you look at this deal, you'll see revenues of 800 billion. You'll see entitlements of 800 billion. That wasn't done by happenstance. The deal that was put forth by President Obama earlier, a few days ago, had revenues of 1.6 trillion and entitlement cuts of 400 billion. One can understand why the Republicans weren't exactly excited about it. But I maintain hope. Could a deal like this be done? Yes, I think. A deal like this was all but done. Okay, my last slide. I'll try to end as positive as I can. I've been in the international budget world for 10 years. I've been all around. Those 4 pictures are different treasury departments or finance departments. By the way, you see the one there in Berlin. If you ever get a chance to go to Berlin, right behind that picture, you can almost see it at the end, is the last remaining section of the Berlin Wall. And that building is the old Luftwaffe building, which wasn't bombed. If you ever get a chance and get a tour of it, it's spectacular, the fact that building. The one down the bottom right, Beijing, spent time there too. I don't recommend that one. The one in Paris, that's something called Bercy. The interesting part of Bercy is that this building was built for them in the 1970s or 80s. Before that, the French Budget Bureau was located in some place you guys may know, the Louvre. They had, their offices were in the corner of the Louvre, and they had to move them out, and so they moved them to this. I think the Budget Bureau lost on the deal, to be honest. And finally, in the London Bureau thing, if you ever get to London, go visit that building, because in the basement of that building was Churchill's headquarters during World War II, and the bunker that's all down there. Interesting. My point of all this isn't just the buildings, but the systems. We got problems. Real problems. I hope I've made that abundantly clear. But would I trade our problems for any of those? No. I was just in Berlin because I was invited to testify before the Deutsche Bundestag on fiscal rules and creating a CBO. And I've been trying to tell them guys, particularly the folks in Brussels, that we did something good back 20 years ago. We switched from Grant-Rudman to the Budget Enforcement Act. That thing I put forth here is the equivalent of extending that, putting in spending caps. So, would I, despite all our problems, would I switch? No. I still like our system. I'm hopeful that we can come out of it.